So I think one of the reasons that in this book, the author chose to focus on Flux as the variant that he really introduced and talked about is because that was the first, I can't say the first one because this concept has been around for a long time in other programming languages, but in terms of React, in terms of JavaScript frontends, Flux was really the first sort of implementation of this model. And it wasn't even when the people who created it are the same group who created React. They work for Facebook now, so React and Flux and sort of the concepts around all that are Facebook ideas. But when Flux was first put together, they didn't even really give a set of reference code, or like, here's code implementing Flux. It was, here's a concept, here's a way to architect your application. And they gave a pretty good outline of that, but there was not a framework to do that. And so a whole bunch of different ones ended up spawning up and being created. The one we're using is alt, right? But I think that's why the focus was on Flux, because it's sort of the first one, this broad overarching concept. Now, talking about what's the most popular right now, Redux is by far, I would say, the largest developer mindshare in terms of the way these work and which one's being used. The good thing is the models that are used in this book, the way that the provider is hooked up and the way that it uses a connect function to do some stuff, some of those confusing bits, are pretty much identical to the way Redux hooks things up. You sort of notice he mentioned throughout this chapter, like, we're going to try and abstract this away, so if you wanted to change what you're using, you can do that. So it would be pretty easy to change over using Redux or something else if there was ever a need to or somebody wanted to. But I definitely heard a lot of confusion over this chapter, which is completely not surprising. It's complex concept. Yes?
Is it, I don't know if this is, but the implication they have for, like, I guess, putting it in is like using the library, kind of like a similar format to like if you were importing CSS or JavaScript into a file. That was what they were doing.
What are you talking about?
It's like they have like import.
Do you mean, are you talking about at the, just a moment, the point where it's setting up the provider?
Yeah.
With this module.export?
Yeah.
Bit? Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit too.
I think it's actually a little higher than that.
Oh, here?
Like, kind of like that, but it goes into like more detail.
So, I mean, this import, all this is doing, and this we should be pretty comfortable with, is just grabbing a library of code and pulling it into this file so that you can use it, right? Thing I sort of didn't even notice until today. I sort of did, but I didn't really pay attention. There is one thing, sort of magic going on in this application when we do these imports, and that doesn't happen unless you hook something up. So if you normally, when you import a package in your code, you have to have first installed that package into your code base. And usually the way you do that is you run an npm install command. Like, ooh, I want to go npm install, I don't know, there's millions of packages on here, but you could want to npm install and let's say an Easter egg package. It's going to let you hide little Easter eggs in an application or something. So typically you npm install it and save it either in your save dev works or that'll save it into your package.json file so that when you reinstall in that same project, it'll get installed again. And you may have noticed there's no steps in the tutorial to run npm install, save, dev, or anything like that. We just added import alt from alt here. And there's a little bit of a footnote that he has. Let me try and find it.
That's right there.
I think it might be right under here. If you check out Webpack output, you'll likely see it installing new dependencies in the project. And there's a little bit of code running that's noticing dependencies that you have that it requires that aren't local. So there's two different ways you can reference a dependency. If you have like React or UUID, that means it's looking for the node module in your node modules folder. So it expects them in this folder. But if you have them using sort of this relative path, /notes, /libs, that's a file directory path from wherever this file is. So if we look at where app.jsx is right now, which is right here, and if you go ... that means go up a folder. So now we're in components and then the libs folder and then connect, for example. That's a relative one. So if it's a relative one, it's not going to do this sort of auto install. But if it's one of these ones that's looking for the node modules folder because of another package that is installed already, it's automatically installing those. So if you ever noticed when you commit your changes at the end of a chapter or when you're working on it, your package.json file is getting changed and those new dependencies are sort of magically appearing in here as things that will show up for your project. But that's not exactly what you were talking about, was it?
Like that part right there. Like that right there.
Right here?
All in Chromebook.
In Chrome.
Necessarily all in it's saying like export default.
So this is a standard just exporting a component. That's nothing really magical and new from anything that we've done before. These bits are, you can think of them as something you probably don't need to know about, at least not right now. But all that's going on here, this setup, we even wrote we have the setup file that was created ourselves, right? And it's this sort of one line, oh, where is it at? Maybe it's after this. Here we go. It's just like one line thing. And all this is a function that takes one argument, which is called alt, and just returns an empty object right now. So when setup alt is being called, that's being called because that's what we imported was set up here. All that it's doing is returning an empty object. What you could be doing there if you wanted to, and why it's set up that way, is you could do some modifications to this alt object to enhance it in some way, which I can't remember. Is that what we did? It wasn't in the setup, was it? Where'd setup go? It's in here. Right. No, it's not in there. You could add some modifications or enhance your object in some way if you want. And this Chrome debug, that's sort of doing the same thing. All you're doing is passing a reference to this alt object into this Chrome debug function. And that's so that if you're running the Chrome developer tools for alt, that it's going to be able to look at that object and inspect it and give you information in those developer tools. Otherwise, it wouldn't know what object to be looking at to give you information on. It needs some sort of reference to the object, and that's all that is just passing in a reference. So when if anybody installed the Chrome developer tools, which I can't remember where they're mentioned, like Chrome debug tools for alt, then let me see here. Probably going to tell me I have to reinstall my system or reboot. I hope not though. All right, let's see. Let's see if this works because I didn't try and install these yet. There we go. Refresh my page. Is it going to work? Let's look at our stores. I do not know if it is hooked up correctly right now. But these are some tools to help you see what's going on. So these will be much more useful in the next chapter when you're actually taking actions with this alt Flux framework and you're hooking stuff up to notes, because you'd be able to go over here and sort of see what actions have taken place. Let me find a good example of using something else. Bet you, I don't know if this site is built using this. If not, I will find another one, but must not be. What's a good example? I'll bet you they've got some examples. I want to see the example. I want to run it. I don't know. I can show you that a little later. Oh, wait. Here we go. Oh, that didn't run it. Here we go. Maybe the sandbox will work. Let me see. Ton of stuff showed over there. I may not have the Redux tools installed in this browser. I may only have them on some of my other ones. So that might not work anyways. I can show you an example of that at another time, but it's really, really useful to be able to sort of see what's going on in your developer tools for all the actions that have been dispatched in your application. It's I'll find some good examples for you, because it's an impressive capability. It really helps you understand how your application works too.
Jared, while you're there,
yeah.
Get back in that same section. There was another keyword in the provider. The last block there. Can you walk through that? That was really confusing too.
The export.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can rewrite that, I think, which will help it make more sense. But if we were to, if we're looking at that, let me look at the production one, because it's the cleaner one to look at, right? So this, you sometimes in JavaScript, especially in these JSX things, you might have to look for what I call like waypoints. And they're symbols that mean something to the computer, but waypoints help you figure out what's going on in your code. So here we go. Okay, this looks like a fat arrow function. So this is some sort of function going on here. And there's a little bit of, I would say, some shorthand that I wouldn't do, because I think it can be confusing with the way this was written, because I don't like breaking out my stuff into multiple lines this way when it intends for it to all be sort of one statement. If I were going to do that, I would wrap it with, say, parentheses, because that's a more explicit way of saying this is one expression and it should be treated as such. But when you're in a JSX file as opposed to straight JavaScript, and you're just writing JSX, you don't necessarily have to do that, because it'll parse it out and turn it into something a little different. So if we want to rewrite this bit by bit, because this is sort of just a function, and if we parsed it out and rewrote it in a little bit different way, let me do it up above it actually instead. We could have this be a function, and we could call this, I don't know, we could call it provider if we want. And this function takes an argument, and really the argument is props, because this is just a React component, just like any other React component. So the argument it always takes is props if you're writing a functional React component. And what we're doing here is the shorthands to dereference a single item out of our props. So we can, which is the children. So we can assign that here if we want. We can say const children equals props.children. Writing this out in sort of the most verbose way I could write this same function. So now we've got the same children object that at this point, all we've done so far is with these couple lines is reproduce essentially this bit of the code. So now that we have that, the rest of it's going to be pretty much the same, where you would say return. And again, I like to use the parentheses to explicitly state like what's going inside of here is all one expression. So now it's just this alt container React component. And that came from right here that we imported. So that's just a React component that we imported. And it has a single property that it's expecting, which is what's the Flux implementation that I'm going to use. And we're telling it alt. This is the concrete implementation of a Flux instance that we want to use. And then we say, all right, inside of that, render the children that were passed into it. And then we're done with that. So we close it out. When it says render children, every React component as part of its props gets a children property. And that children property is essentially anything that is a child element or a child component of that one. So if we were to look in, let's talk about HTML as a comparison, which is very, very similar. The children of body in this HTML, or the children of HTML in this document, are head and body. And the children of body are this div element, this script element, and this script element. So in this code here, what's happened is it knows the children that were passed into this component where it was created, and it's just rendering them inside of it. So in order to know what those children are, you have to go and look, where was this guy called, or where was this created from? And the next step up there for this is, I believe, app.jsx. No, hold on. It's the index, right? Not this index. I'm not nervous at all about him writing on the board right now. So it's the index is where the provider was, this alt container provider is being called. And we see it right here. So the children of it, it's just the app component is the only child. So essentially what happens is whenever it renders this, it renders an alt container around the app component inside of it.
The alt container, that's not part of React, it's part of the alt framework.
Yeah, it's part of the alt framework. It's a React component, but it's there just to hook up some of these Flux items, which will make the connections between what we talked about. Like, what day is it? On Saturday? We'll make the connection between what we talked about on Saturday from the code cartoons with the dispatcher, the actions or action creators, the stores, the views, the different types of views, and what these different Flux portions are hooking up during class today, so that hopefully that'll make sense.
You guys have a second? Sorry to interrupt. You should have seen on Slack. We're gonna have people get together at 5:30 next Tuesday. There'll be some. Feel free to invite friends, family. But if you are going to invite other people, please let us know on the invite. I'm good.
I'm not sure I can make it. I have a class then. Oh, never mind.
Exactly. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. You're good. You can stay. So I hope that, that breaks it down a little bit and makes more sense. This children approach, this is a very common pattern you'll see in a lot of React development, where you will actually pass the children in at a higher level and then just render the children inside of the component inside of it. And what that allows you to do when you're building out an application is it allows different layers of the application to be concerned about different things very, very easily. So it makes it very sort of composable. So if you had, and we sort of do that already with notes, I believe. Except here, let me check. Well, we passed in the notes directly and had it render them. But there's a lot of examples where maybe something doesn't care about its content and it doesn't need to directly render that content. And in fact, you want it to be flexible to not. So let me give a really quick example of when you might do something like that. Let's just say we're creating a tab component in React, right? So if we were to create something that's like tabs, and you want to be able to generically create any number of tabs and put any sort of content inside of them that you want, well, we've all seen that in UIs somewhere, right? So it looks a little something like this. This is our active tab, and then, let's give that some extra shading because that's the one that's active right now. And then you'll have some other tabs that are a little smaller in the background that you might switch over to, right? But a lot of times you don't necessarily like this concept of the tab. Yeah, let's get rid of that line because for the active one we don't want it. The concept of the tab is reusable for each one of these, even if the content is different. So the first tab might be settings, and the next tab might be, I don't even know, print. And I have no idea what our last tab is going to be. But the reusable bit of a tab, you want to be able to reuse that without it being directly bound to what's inside of it. So if you were doing that as, say, a React component, simply, you could have const tab as a new React component, and that could take in some props. And we'll use a fat arrow function this time for our component. Let me at least tell it that this file is JavaScript if I can figure out how to do that. So it'll give me some syntax highlighting.
If it's down there, spaces, text.
Thank you. Oh, I wonder if it doesn't know JSX, does it? Maybe it knows React. Maybe it does know JSX. Aha. All right. So the challenge here is we want to have some sort of tab component. We want it to do some sort of rendering, because it needs to render the idea of a tab itself. So it needs some sort of div for maybe the tab up top. And it might get in there, maybe it renders the props.tab name. And so that thing may have a class name of tab header. Because this is React, I have to put all of this inside of one top level div. I forget about that. And then we'll have one that's the tab body. And this is the content of the tab. But we want this to be able to vary tab to tab. We don't want to have this always be the exact same, right? So what we could do here is props.children. So we'll render whatever children were passed into our tab in the body there. Now I need to close my top level div. And then if I had some other components, some other React component, which we'll call our app, I guess. And this guy doesn't really care what's coming into him because, or return. So the app is, this has a class name of app. Let's close that div. And now we're going to render some tabs inside of there. And this tab has a tab name of, what's our first tab? Settings. And we may want to, here's where we may want to define what those settings are. You know, whatever. Div, I don't know. Always on top. Or div, let's make this like some sort of social marketing website. Opt into tracking. Yeah, so I want to opt into the tracking, and, you know, some other items in there, and then the end of that tab. And the great thing was this tab now is a reusable component because it doesn't need to know what actually renders inside of it, because it just renders whatever children we pass into it each time. And we can have another instance of that tab. That is our print tab, and that can have different content inside of it. So that's sort of the model for why it's really useful to be able to render just your children and not have to know what those children are all the time. Does that make sense? The benefit from that? I'll just leave that up over there. So yeah, this should be functionally the same. So if I changed this code now and we just exported provider instead of what we were exporting before. Let's make sure my builds are working. Nothing went wrong. And functionally, yay, we're still working. So that's a different way to write that. Again, he's very, very fond of this dense syntax, and this is not as dense as it gets. It's like, we're going to get into the ones that I have a hard time reading just a little bit farther down.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any questions before that or anything at this sort of the start of setting up this alt instance? After you get past this point, did the idea of a singleton make sense?
Yeah, I'll read it.
What's a singleton?
Just saying that you can use it without that. I guess keep calling it.
Right. It just means that, well, what it means is anytime anyone requests that object, or usually an instance of that object, they get the same one. So you can't create multiple of it. Everything always gets that same object back. Is essentially what that means. So we could write one really easily without using a module. In JavaScript, some other languages, it's really hard to write singletons, or it's really weird. Like in Java, I can't say it's really hard, but it's just a weird way to write them in Java or in C# or things like that. But in JavaScript, it would be really, really simple to write a singleton, for example, because you could write a function let me just call it foo singleton. And what's happened here is, let's create an object. And foo is going to have one property, bar, our standard boring object. But we're not actually going to return that. Instead, we're going to return a function. We'll just call it get foo instance. What this function is going to do is just return foo. So once we've created our foo singleton, if you will, which I guess I'm going to assign into foo here. I mean, this isn't perfect, but now anytime we would try and call foo, we get like bar, foo bar. We should be getting back the exact same object. So if I assign this to something else, and then b equals foo, a equals b should be true. Which remember is not true even if we have two objects that look the same. So if I did this separately, or two objects, let's make them look exactly the same as what I had before. I'm gonna feel really foolish. There we go. That didn't work. Because those aren't the exact same object. They just have the same structure. Whereas every time you call foo, you're getting back the same instance of that object. They all point to the same thing. So there's other things that that means too. So if I did like a dot is foo, and I added a method to it, and that method is just going to return true. Now A has that, and B just got the same method because they're the same object. That's what a singleton means, is no matter how many times you try and get an object, you get that exact same object. All right. So how about this? This is a little different than something that we've done before. And you could have done this differently. Are there any questions about what's sort of going on here in this module bit? I don't think it really matters right now for us.
I'm not understanding that you're saying it's 1.2, 1.2 exports or modules. But I didn't understand why.
Right. And one thing that's a little confusing is why is this syntax different than the way that we've exported otherwise? And that's because the reason the syntax is different, and it's not just export, you know, this item or whatever, is because the syntax we've been using, export and import, is the ES6, the JavaScript built-in module syntax. But until, well, there's very little that supports dynamic modules with that approach, which means that it evaluates the code and only imports it when it's sort of evaluated it. Instead, it has to evaluate it when it first reads that module. It has to know what it's actually importing or exporting when it compiles that module, when you use that syntax. This syntax is an older syntax that's came from Node.js, and it's called CommonJS. It's an older module syntax for JavaScript, but it allows for dynamic, so on the fly, it can do something different. What that means is when this code is running, depending on the environment that it runs in, it will fetch one or the other of these modules. It won't always pull in the same one. Whereas using ES6 module syntax, it's always going to pull in that one module during build time, or you can't dynamically change that because it pulls it in too soon before it can do any actual computation on that file. That's not quite true. ES6 modules do support this. It's just not very common. So this is a much more common pattern when you do something like this. So where did a lot of the confusion start then for people who are in this chapter? Because I understand, I mean, I do think it's a confusing chapter. Ton being introduced to you. The connect part. Okay. So let's, I think right about here, yeah, right before connect, we'll skip over understanding connect, because I actually think this stuff makes a lot more sense when we start implementing it in the next chapter. It makes a lot more sense when you start seeing what it's doing versus when you're putting something on there but not actually changing anything with it. But we'll talk about the different roles that these are playing. So if you remember last class, we talked about the different states or different roles in a Flux workflow. Does anybody remember what the different players were in like a Flux workflow? Action, dispatcher, store, views. Yeah. So that's really what you have, right? You've got your action, dispatcher, store, and view. And it is, I'm gonna go down a little bit here. It's broken down a little bit more in the idea of a controller view and a view as well. So a controller view is the one that's really hooked up to the data. So let's take a look at what we've been implementing in this chapter and figure out where they fit in this sort of workflow. It is mentioned pretty early on, we're not really doing anything with the dispatcher because that's implicit in this alt implementation unless you want to change it. So we didn't really implement the dispatcher directly in any of the code in this chapter. So that leaves actions, stores, and views as things that we may have implemented using some of these different bits of code. So let's try and take a look at what's going on here and how we're connected up. So the first way that we hook into our application is we've wrapped our app in this provider component, right? So what we did is took our previous app, which was this top level component, and wrapped the provider component around it. And what that's doing, sorry, for the most part here is, am I still on? Good, just want to check that. That's the way that the state management of alt can hook into your React application and pass stuff down through it. So it mentions, I think just above here, or it might be below here, I'm not sure where it's at, a little something that we don't really talk about too much in React. Let me look for it. Which is the context. So far we've learned of two ways to have data, two ways to represent data in a React component, or two properties, well, hard to say that, on a React component that provide the data for the component. Do you remember what those two different properties are? State and props. And they work differently. Could anyone explain the difference between state and props on a React component? Yeah, it's a good question.
State changes, props don't.
Yeah, in a sense, I think that's a great summary. You can't directly change the props of a React component. They can only be changed by re-rendering that component with new props. Whereas you can directly change the state on your component. So if the component needs to manage its own state and change it, and something else isn't going to be passing that in, you handle that with state on your component. Whereas if it can always be passed in from something else, you can handle it with props, which can always pass some props down. There's actually a third data communication model in React that you don't usually end up needing to hook into, but is used by a lot of these other frameworks that plug into React, and that's known as the context. And that's a way to pass stuff down through a whole bunch of React components without having to have the intermediate React components know about it. Because the one challenge with props is, for example, when we have it in our app, if you set a prop in app, and you want to pass that down through, like on edit or on delete, and it keeps needing to get passed through, you have to pass it down layers even if they don't do something with it. So if notes does nothing with on delete directly, it still has to pass it down into, well, oh yeah, into the button or whatever here, right? It did nothing with on delete itself. It just really sort of passed it down. I guess it bound it to the ID, but that's an example of what happens when you're working with props. You may have to pass things down through even if you're not doing anything with it. Context lets you get around that, but it's not something you usually implement. And that's a little bit of what's going on when we're setting up our provider. We're setting up a hook here so that our alt Flux implementation has a way to pass information down into our React application bit by bit. So this provider is hooking up this way to notify things in some respect about information coming down through it, and that here's what you need to render. So that, I don't know if it maps directly to one of these items. You could think of it as sort of informing the view dispatcher, if you will, or the, was the other, oops, term that was used instead, the controller view, sort of informing the controller view, but it's not directly implementing one of those states all by itself. It's just giving you a hook into it. Otherwise, it wouldn't know how to hook into your React component. So I'm going to get to connect. Connect is where a lot of the sort of magic is happening in the Flux implementation. This is where a lot of the different bits are being hooked up to implement different things. So let's look at their mock example here of calling connect. And then we'll look at the implementation of connect a little bit as well. In most Flux implementations, you don't create this connects function yourself. So there's a lot of complexity in that little bit of code there that's hidden from most of what you would be doing day to day. Connect is where, in a sense, a lot of the magic bits happen. So let's go down here, and I'm going to use this just to get the terms here for connect, which are state and actions. Those look conveniently like things out of our Flux model here, right? Maybe the terms are a little different, but action and store, state, those are sort of mapping to these different things for our Flux model. So this is, if this is our connect function, it takes a state and it takes some form of actions. We can go back up and look at the connect function here in this example. And what have we passed into it? We passed in as our first parameter a state of some kind. And then the second one would be the actions that can take place. So this is where we're starting to hook up these pieces of Flux. And this is where the different bits are coming in. And again, it'll make a lot more sense when we start building something out in the next chapter. But this is, we're starting to connect all the different bits and pieces of the application through this approach right here. And then the last bit here is app. And this is a really weird syntax the first time you encounter it. So let's, again, break it down bit by bit if we're trying to look at this. So what, if breaking the whole thing down, what is this bit of code right here? I can put that all on one line if it's a little easier, all of this on one line, if it'll be easier to see. Let's go back to this scratch pad here. So breaking it down from the top level on down, more or less, what's going on with this, just this connect portion that we have highlighted right there? And don't think about everything going on inside of it. I mean, at a basic level, what's happening in the code there? Well, maybe I can write a few more examples because I might be a little vague in what I'm saying. If we had this, or here, let's do it with. What's each one of these? That's just a function that's calling, getting some parameters passed in, right? And it might be returning something. Like let's say add 4, 5 is returning, in this case, some sort of value, right? The sum. That's all that's happening here with this first bit of this as well. This is just a function call. Again, this is very dense syntax. Now, this is pretty idiomatic Java or React type stuff, so you'll see this a lot. But we can break this down. So if that's just a function call, let's assign that to something. Call it the connector. I don't know. But let's get rid of this for now because that's not part of just our function. So what is connect returning is the question. Like what comes back from this function? So if we had our add function before and we did that, var sum equals add 4, 5, what would add be returning? Nine, but an integer, right? A number. And then if we had, I don't know what, that's another good one. Let's do var you know nothing else about this code. What would you guess is being returned from this create Jedi?
Or
A string, maybe an object, some sort of Jedi object, or a string saying something, right? Something, right? You don't really know. So let's go back and look at this guy again. And we can actually say, okay, if this is just a function, then this bit after here is happening on whatever was returned from that function. So what would it, this is tricky, and I'm sort of belaboring it a little bit just to have you think about it, because to me this syntax took a long time to understand. But what type of item or object in JavaScript works with this syntax? A function, right? That's how you invoke another function, or that's how you invoke a function, right? So what connect is actually returning is not a number or an object, but it's returning a function that we can call again, and this time pass in something else. So this connect function took 2 arguments, which were some sort of store and some sort of actions object, and returned a function that you can then call with a component as well. So we've encountered sort of functions that return functions before, but only as a side note. Now it's very fundamental to the way that this sort of application is built at this point. Does that sort of make sense up till now? The idea of connect, it takes a store of some kind, and it takes some sort of actions, and then it returns a function, and that function takes a component. Now the question would be, the obvious question after that is, what does this return? What is the function that this had returned when we invoke it? What does that return? And we don't have that right here in this code, unless you sort of take a moment and recognize a little bit about what's going on with this stuff. But I can give you a hint here, so it might make sense. So if that was valid code for me to write, what would you say that the connector function returned when it was invoked? Connected app, yep. And what's a connected app? What type of object is that? What type of object is connected app? It's a React component, because we can invoke it this way, or just write it out as JSX. So what happened is we called connect and we passed in a store and an action. That returned a function. That function takes a component and returns another component. Okay, so what's the purpose in that? What's the value? Why are we doing that? And what does it get us? And that's, again, going back to our Flux guide. So we've already dealt with the store part. We passed in a store of some kind. And we sort of dealt with the actions. And let's ignore the details. We'll come back and talk about that. We said we're not going to deal with the dispatcher, because unless we need to get into the details of how the dispatcher works, alt sort of hides that from us. So there's one other piece that we're missing here, which is the view, right? And the view's easy in the sense that, well, we already have React views, but there's one thing that those didn't have, which was the controller view to tell it when data has changed and to update itself. So in this Flux model, not only do you have your view that says what to render, but you have a controller view that's talking to these stores and updating your other component or your other view whenever that happens. That's what this connected app is actually a controller view, and it's wrapped around what would have been your app before in this example. And I think that the code's a little too dense to see that, so I might show an example of writing what one of those would look like if you wrote it out manually. But it's not far off from the tabs bit that we had a moment ago. Is this helping any at all at this point? What? A little bit? There's, like I say, there's a lot going on in here. This was an example of just an absolute ton. This is very, very dense code. But if we step back again, let me go over here, and we can rewrite this stuff a little bit. And I'm going to say this here, let's ignore it for the time being. That's sort of details of some stuff that don't particularly matter. So let's look at this. If this is our connect function, an actual implementation of how to hook one of these up, it takes a state and it takes actions. And if we ignore this a little bit, We can't perfectly, but let's act like we can. This returns, and this is where I said it gets much more dense, right? This is where you start seeing a whole bunch of stuff all on one line. And you start looking for these waypoints. It returns a function of some kind. All right, so what's on the left-hand side? Well, that function takes a target, which, based off reading this code here, looks like a React component, most likely. And what that returns is, oh, geez, another function? A whole nother function that takes the props and renders it. So this is really like this bit right here. If you can understand this one tiny bit of code, which takes a lot of going over again and again, you'll understand the crux of what's going on in that whole connect function that is taking a couple arguments. Not all of it, but you'll understand the really complicated bits of what's going on in that connect function that takes the store and the actions, and then returns a function that takes a component that then returns another component. Because this function here, if we were to break this out as something entirely separate, that looks a lot like a React component, a functional React component, right? It just takes props and renders something. The only weird part about it is what it's rendering is this component that was passed into it, and then it's adding some props into it to go with that. So that's sort of to me, this little bit right here is the crux. If you can understand that, you'll understand a lot of the way that connect function is working. And so if we were to, let's try and write something that operates a little bit like that, because what that's doing is a very, very common React pattern. And it's the idea of just adding some other behavior to a component. I think we've actually done it in some of the stuff that we've already written. It's editable, an example, I believe. I'm not sure. Let's see. I don't know if it is. So let's go back and create our tabs again. For the sake of argument here, we can create a tab component. And that's going to be a function. It takes some props. And I'm going to do the little gloss over. It renders a tab, right, internally. I guess I do want to show what it renders for the sake of this, because I want to show what might change. So let's say that, this is very similar to what we had before. We've got a div. That's the top level. A div down here. And then we're going to have our top level bit of the tab. We'll have a class name of tab header, and just like before, we're going to render the props.tab name into it. And we'll end that div, and then we'll have a div of some content. We'll just do the children like we did before, because that's, I think, the best way to pass stuff in like that. We've got a very, very simple tab component here. One thing that's a common React pattern is we may create another component that wraps this component and just adds some behavior to it or sets it in a very specific way. So let's create a, let's create a bold tab. This guy just takes props too. Same as before. And we don't want to recreate all of this tab functionality. All we're doing is we're just going to make the tab names bold, always bold. So, or maybe, let me call this a header tab so that we'll call it a header tab. Change it a tiny bit there. So this guy, what he's really going to do is just return a tab with all of the props that got passed into him. Put right onto that tab. And right now you're going, well, what does this do? How does this do anything different than the original tab? But we can change it just a tiny bit. So let's say our tab name now, we want to change so that instead of just being the string that it was before, and there's going to be some problems with this, but I'm going to sort of gloss over it. The syntax here is a little off. Let's say that before we just had some sort of string or something like that as our tab name. But now our tab name, and we'll get it up here so that this will make it a little easier. Tab name equals, we're going to make it a header. And inside of there, we'll render our props.tab name. And in the header, so this is just a React component. Now our tab name will be equal to this, and so there's no naming confusion inside of here. Let's make sure that nobody can get confused. So the only thing we've done is created a header tab component, and the only thing this header tab component does is render a tab, but force the tab name to be wrapped in H1 HTML elements. So it's going to be bold, big, bold. It didn't change anything else about this tab. So you can think of it as having wrapped this and just injected some properties into it or changed some properties. It even used the existing properties that would have gotten passed into the tab had it been a generic tab. That's the same thing that's happening in the connect here. Is this target is your original component. So in the code that we have, say, up here, that target is the app. And all it's doing is manipulating the properties a little bit to add some additional properties to it, maybe some actions and the state, so that it's now connected to the state of your store. And it will know, it'll be updated when this connector function knows that that state has changed in some way. So this is a really tough topic for me because I have a hard time. There's certain topics I feel like I can explain and think I know how to explain it in a way that makes sense to people. This is one I've probably tried to explain a half dozen times, and I'm not certain that I explain it in a way that comes across and makes sense. So is this helping? Is it making sense how this is hooking things up at all at this point? Yeah.
Will we need this in the future?
What? Not the, oh, in that file? Not this whole bit right here? Oh yeah. Okay. Sure. That's an easy one, right? To me. So you've got the hard things to me, which are the concepts, the new ways to think. This is just a little bit of syntax. So syntax should not be that intimidating. You can be like, oh, I didn't know that syntax. Now I learned something new. Okay, I'll be able to reference that again in the future. So all this is doing is a little bit of a syntactic shorthand to mix this in. Let me I think this will work. I think it works in the browser now, so I'll check. So if we had our, we have our A object, right? Foo bar is foo right now. So if we wanted to, let's reassign B equals object.assign. Remember right now, let me do this. B is the same and A equals B. So they point to the same place in memory, the actual same object. So now let's do this. B, I'll do C just so that object.assign. And I'm going to do a couple here. I'll do an empty object as its first parameter. And then I was hoping it would give me some help, and then A as its second parameter. If we look at C, it looks like it has the same parameters, right? Foo bar and is foo. So what do you think the result of this is going to be? False. Can anyone take a guess as to why?
Takes the first object and it like merges it with the second one.
Yeah.
Creates a new one.
Yeah. So what it's doing is object.assign. Let's look it up real fast. This is where whenever you have questions on stuff like that, what you should just be doing is search. Like look it up and read. There's plenty of documentation out there on how this stuff works. The object.assign method is used to copy the values of all enumerable owned properties. There's some complex technical wording here. From one or more source objects to a target object. It will return the target object. So if we look at the syntax, it says object.assign target object source objects, and it can be as many as you want. And then it's got some examples here. Object.assign target object is an empty object. And this other object, well, now we've got a copy of our original object, but it's not the same thing because what it did was, since this was a new object and it added all of these into it, it's still a different object. It's pointing to a different location in memory. But this first argument is always the target object. So we could also write instead, if we wanted to mix in a new property, let's do A equals object.assign A, and let's add another property into this. We already have bar. Let's have, yeah, let's do the answer. And let's just make that 42. So now A has that, and B has that, and A is still equal to B because we mixed in, essentially, we added an additional property into the A object. And you're thinking, that was really, really convoluted. It's a lot easier to just do A dot the answer equals something. And you're right when you're working with one property or one thing at a time. But if you have two objects with 10 different properties on them and you're trying to mix them in together, it's really nice to not have to do that property by property by property and to be able to mix them together very easily. And that's what object.assign is doing. So if we go back and look at that again, object.assign, let's break it down. We're targeting a new object, so we're going to create a new object. Our next thing, these are our sources, are all of the properties that are passed into this React component. And then the actions, well, the actions weren't in this React component. They came from the original call to connect. So it's also mixing in the actions that were passed into connect. And this dot, dot, dot syntax, that we've encountered a couple times. That's just that spread notation. So if you do that dot, dot, dot A, it may not work. And let me try it here. D equals dot, dot, dot A, that syntax might work. All that's doing is spreading out each individual property of that object into a new object. So again, now here D looks the same as A or B, but A equals 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 D should be false because they're actually pointing at different things. It just took all of the properties of A and mixed them in to this new object. So breaking that down, we're creating a new object. We're adding all of the properties of props, the props object into it, which was here. We're adding all of the properties of actions, which is here, into it. And then we're spreading that into this target component. And by doing that, they become properties directly on this target component call, which means there'll be properties on that object when it gets called. So we did that same syntax. I did a little bit of it here when I was showing this tab, this header tab, where I did ... props. So what that does is just takes anything that was being passed in here and adds it on as if they were all separate. So if we called header tab, we invoked it, and we passed in several properties. This is ... props. All of these get turned into a property object, which gets passed in here. So it sort of looks like this when it gets called. Right? And I'm not going to write out the other one. It sort of looks like that inside of this props. And then when we did that ... props here, all that does is add each one of those onto the tab so it looks exactly the same way it did here. And then we added in another one, right? Then we added in a tab name again, which now is a React component. It would be look like that. And yeah, it would have mixed both of these into this object, but since tab name is redefined here, this is the one that would end up being applied. So that's what that, ultimately what this is. But these are, like I say, I think these are the easy items. They can be hard when you encounter them, but I look at that and go, oh, that's just some sort of syntax I don't know. Okay, I can learn syntax. But learning how to build something using a whole different approach, a whole different model, a way of thinking about stuff, those are the hard problems to me. Oh man, that's going to take me a long time. Syntax, I can tackle that. Not intimidated by it. Any other? I mean, I know that, again, like I said, this is a very, very dense chapter. There's a lot going on. I don't even think it's actually worth, you guys can dig into what's going on here if you want. I don't think it's particularly worth it because there's just a lot of complexity that is sort of behind the scenes type complexity for building a Flux model. If you're really interested in that, there is a great talk. I can't remember if I sent this out. But Egghead.io has a talk on getting started with Redux. This is a series from the guy who created Redux, Dan Abramov. And he basically has you build, like he starts off talking about how it works and then sort of has you build your own Redux from scratch, which is a lot like what we did in this Connect. This is the vast majority of the hooking up of a Redux type tool. It's not the most efficient way, but that's the vast majority of the code for something like this is all right in this one file. Are there any questions about that? Completely lost now. Yes? I know I'm in trouble and Cruz is shaking his head yes to that.
So a store is just a database, right?
A store, yeah, it's just a database, if you will. Yeah. It's just an object. It can just be an object. It doesn't matter. It's a just information of some kind somewhere. In this case, they're basically objects. So we actually hook one up right at right here, sort of. Here's our actual connect where we connect something up. And what we did was our store is this little JavaScript object right here. Or this, the way it's actually written out, our store is this whole thing. So our store is a function. And that function, no matter what it's given, always returns this same JavaScript object, which just has test test. So that's an example of a store here. Now, it probably could have been an object directly, but it might be harder to know how to change that object. Whereas with a function, the good thing about a function like this, and we'll see it later, is that you can then pass it parameters, and those parameters can influence what happens to the content inside of it, right? Just like any function. So that's how you'll end up making changes to a store, is a store will be able to take an action more or less and know what to do with that action to change the state of the store. So if we went back up, again, a lot of this is really complex bits that we can sort of gloss over. If we went back up here and looked at all of this function, this is where it's looking at, it calls it state, or sort of using that interchangeably with store. And it's saying, oh, if this is a function or it's an object with some sort of keys, then what I actually want you to return is this connect function down here, which takes the state and return, well, this is a default, right? So takes our state, takes our actions, and takes our target and does something with it. And what it's actually doing here is just creating another React component that's going to wrap it. So this is how it does this actual React component wrapping. And this is how it can be notified when something has happened, one of these actions has happened essentially, and needs to be triggered. This is where it hooks up to this sort of dispatch so that it knows to be notified of stuff. But a lot of those details, I don't think those are, you can really dig into them if you want, but I don't think they're particularly valuable in terms of what we're trying to get out of this right now. Let me check and see if there's anything else I feel is critical that we missed here.
We have to do this once, right? And we don't have to see it again.
I don't think we'll have to see. Yeah, we shouldn't have to. I cannot remember off the top of my head. We shouldn't have to see this stuff again unless we're just converting it to a more efficient version. Because this is all the backing bits, the underlying portion. You'll continue to see this consistently, because this is the key part here. Once you've got your concept of how to hook up your store bits, then connecting your different components to it, that's the critical aspect. And basically what you're doing there, like I said, it takes the store and actions, returns a function that takes a component, returns another component. The reason it's doing all of that is so that it can know, oh, here's an action that this store cares about in some way. When this action happens, we need to, this connect function says, oh, if this action has been called, or one of these actions has been called, pass that into the store to change it in some way. That's that dispatcher bit, sort of magic behind the scenes. And then the connected component bit says, oh, now that store has changed. Luckily, I've wrapped the component that needs information from it with this connector. And so now I just re-render that component with the new store, and that'll re-render the actual underlying component as well. But yeah, this is the bit that you're going to see again and again, which is why I spent a lot of time breaking down what's going on in that connect call. The underlying portions you shouldn't encounter again, and I've never had to write any of that functionality before outside of this. It's more important to understand how it hooks up and how it works and how you connect components to get information and updates. Any other questions on that? More confused than before? Yeah. Like I said, I think it's actually worse that we're not using it to change any data yet. I think it becomes easier in the next chapter because when you're actually hooking the store up and that's changing your data, it starts to make more sense what's going on. When you're just talking about it abstractly here and you haven't hooked it up to do any rendering or change anything, it's really hard to visualize the whole flow of what happens.
Maybe for next class, everybody should make sure that they go through the implementing node store and node actions chapter.
Yeah, even if they, don't finish, they definitely should have tried to read through it and understand how to move the stuff over for it, because that's where it'll make a lot more sense. Where, just a second, where here we're starting to create the actual actions that are going to be dispatched, and we're going to bind them so that they'll actually change your store, and then there's what I'm looking for. So you're seeing we're changing from using states to updating our actions here, and at the very, must be at the top of it, more or less. At the very top, you're doing a lot of the connecting of, so this is the connection that's binding everything together so that stuff will flow through the application and update. And then after that, you're sort of building out the store and the actions so that they'll work. And I think it will make a lot more sense. I also think it'll make a lot more sense. I definitely encourage you to install those alt developer tools that were referenced in this chapter for Chrome. And when you're running your code, pull up a developer tools window next to it and pull up the alt interface here and watch what's going on as you do that. I do have just a few minutes. Let me see if I can find, if I have the Redux tools on here. Maybe they're just not enabled. Hold on, over here. Maybe I just don't have them enabled. Ah, yes. They're just not enabled. Oh, okay, there we go. All right. So it should, now let me try this Redux bit again. See if I can get this example working. Because if I can, I think it'll help out there too. And it may not work here since this is this sort of second layer sandbox view. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to work directly. It's not seeing anything, is it? Redux. Let's try. Let's try and refresh the whole page. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. I don't know if it will, because that's running in a. I'd like to not run it in a sandbox like that. So let me see. Just trying to find an example that I could show a little bit of what's going on here. Wish I could throw something together real fast too, but. No. Oh, there we go. This should be, there we go. All right. So this is like a very simple, this is Redux, which is very similar. But what you can see here is a lot of the different stuff taking place. So here's our initial state of our data for Redux. The only difference between Redux and the Flux bit is Flux, you can have different stores. Redux, all your stores really in one place. That's the major difference. So initially, we can look at our state. Our counter is the only thing in our store, and as a value, it's just 0. And the action that sort of set that up was this init action, so really nothing. And this button here, what that did was that dispatched the increment counter action. And if we look here, we can see it's just type increment counter. That's all that action was. But the store, the logic inside the store was looking at that and said, oh, I know what to do with increment action. What I do is I add 1 to my count. So here's the difference. Counter went from 0 to 1. And the current state now is 1. Once that state changed to 1, that connector that's connected to this component, which we should be able to see in the React tools, if it'll let us switch over to them. Let's see. Look at that. It looks very similar. We got a provider and a connect function here. This connect function is wrapped around our counter. And that connect function is what's hooked up to our store so that when our store changes, it knows to re-render this connect function, which re-renders the counter with the new props. There's a weird quirk. I have to, can't be on the last tab, I guess. No, did I click wrong? So every time you click that, it's just dispatching that increment counter action again, which is changing your state step by step. And then you have your new value, which is now rendered inside of your UI because the views are hooked up. And here I click the auto increment, so now it's just spinning up really quickly, firing off a ton of these events. And all right, I can stop that. And another great thing about working with a tool like this, especially with the dev tools, is you can usually, and I haven't worked with those alt ones, so we'll have to see, you can usually go back and look at what the state was at different points in time. So we can look back and say, oh, what was the state here? And obviously so many of them spun through that it had to clear the history a little bit. It couldn't hold on to all of them. So it's not the true start, but you could jump back to different points in time. Now this seems really trivial because we only have one action that we can dispatch, but you can imagine when there's a lot of stuff going on in your application, it's really powerful to be able to see all of these different actions happening, everything taking place in there. and how that works. If I had my work code on here, I could show you a much more complex example. Maybe I'll get something like that running for the next class. But this is just really invaluable when you're learning this sort of Flux framework to help you understand what's going on. Click, click, commit it. Maybe there's some other examples in here. Does this person, did they host other ones? They might have. No, it's not going to work. All right. We can talk more about that in the next class when we actually have some of this stuff implemented. So please try and work towards getting the notes actions hooked up, the notes store for the next class. And that's what we'll talk about. Not 100% sure we'll make it all the way through that, but I hope we're making good progress, at least on that. And please feel free to ask more questions about this on Slack or anything. It's a very complex topic. I'm not kidding. I've been working with this concept for 2 years, and there's still a lot of things that I encounter day in and day out that are a challenge for me in this model. So it's quite a challenging concept, but it's also very, very powerful to learn. All right, for everybody watching online, I'm done. See you guys later.